At a panel I was hosting during MagicCon Vegas a few weeks ago, an audience member asked a question that really got me thinking.
I've been trying to build a hidden commander, and I don't know how to make it work. It's the Sig Ceremony. It's 3 black. Creature spells cost 2 less to cast, and whenever a creature you control enters, if you cast it, destroy that creature, then you get a token. I don't want to just make it a token instead. How do I make weird niche hidden commanders work?
Hidden commanders are an interesting subject, but they definitely aren't all made equal. I responded to this person's question, as well as my co-host's answer, by saying that some of the classically touted examples of build-around cards, such as Sunforger, are deceptively simple to pull off because the cards they work with don't eat up that much deck space. Red and white instants that cost 4 or less mana are good, and you'll already want some of them in your deck. Equipments are also good, and you should be able to find some other options to grab if you want to run tutors for your Sunforger. However, for a secret commander that typically requires more deck space to support it, as the Sig Ceremony often does, you'll need to thread the needle a bit more carefully in deck building.
The second question would be, are there analogs? Are there cards that will do what you want to do with the Sig Ceremony, kind of, that aren't it? Because if people get to know this deck, they will start removing this card very, very rapidly. So I think that would be the other thing you want to look at is if you are dedicating a lot of deck space to this card, what else can work with those cards? I think that's kind of where you need to be looking.
And that felt like pretty good advice to give generally. Cards don't always get drawn, and sometimes get removed. I'd tangled with the Sig Ceremony myself a bit a year prior for a video building a deck based around cards chosen by my patrons, so I had some familiarity with that card in particular and its challenges, but I'm by no means an expert. That deck was a little on the goofy side, and the card isn't really my first choice as a build-around in the first place, so I figured it could be somebody else's job to be a scholar on the Sig Ceremony in particular. However, that plan was upended about a week later when I was spinning a wheel to decide what deck I'd build for the Magic Mirror podcast. My card...
Pretty much the same thing. Dragonstorm.
Oh no. Oh, please no.
Oh, yes.
Oh, God, no. I don't want it.
This card keeps coming up.
Let's go.
The set of wheels I created spun me into building a $60 budget deck with 50 or more subtypes in some way centered around the Sig Ceremony, this old nemesis of mine. At this point, I just accepted that I needed to create a full-effort build-around for this card in order to shake whatever curse had caused it to follow me. And to be clear, I do mean an honest-to-God bracket 3 deck. Maybe a little janky by choice and by nature of the requirements going into this deck, but no jankier than that, and with plenty of powerful plays up its sleeve. In the process of doing precisely this, I ended up landing on 2 principles that should guide anybody building a deck centered around a card in their 99. One of these being something I directly identified at the panel, and the other one being something I kind of alluded to more indirectly, and have since developed further. These principles are, 1. Find analogs for your central card, and 2. Minimize the footprint of cards that synergize with your central card, with both principles stemming from the essential fact that you simply won't always have access to your hidden commander card. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through my process of building a Sig Ceremony deck, and in doing so, demonstrate how these 2 rules produced a successful hidden commander deck. To start with, let's discuss the nature of hidden commanders a bit, and why the Sig Ceremony is one of the trickier ones you can choose. The phrase hidden commander simply refers to a deck where one of the cards in the 99 is built around more heavily than the commander itself. My Shroom Astral Slide deck is an example of this, where Astral Slide is a key piece of how the deck works, and Shroom plays more of a secondary role in adding flexibility and resilience to the deck. This type of deck usually involves some number of tutors to find the core card, although whether or not a deck tutors for its hidden commander every game might depend on the nature of the card a bit. Astral Slide is a ridiculously powerful late game tool, so I'll almost always want a copy of the card at some point, even if I survived the early to mid game without it. For purposes of adhering to Principle 1, having analogs, Astral Slide makes my job easy because it has a functionally identical card as well as a similar enchantment in a different color, effectively giving me 3 copies of my key card. I don't need to get creative finding cards to do something similar, they're just handed to me. Other hidden commanders make principle number 2 the easy one, allowing a player to minimize the footprint of cards that work with their central card quite easily, and not feel like their deck space is being gobbled up. As I mentioned earlier, Sunforger is a great build-around because the cards it works with span a wide range of different roles, and since they don't even need to be in hand for Sunforger to synergize with them, the challenge of figuring out the right number of instants to guarantee setup and payoff lining up is basically non-existent. So these are two secret commanders where one of the two principles I mentioned earlier is basically guaranteed, easing a bit of the challenge of deck building. However, some hidden commanders don't make either of these two principles easy, and this brings us to the Sib-Sig ceremony. Let's start, as I did when building this deck, by tackling what this card does. The first line of text is 100% upside. It makes our creature spells cost 2 less. That's a pretty great effect for 3 mana. Urza's Incubator and Semblance Anvil come the closest to this rate among artifact-based reducers, but each of these has a substantial downside or limitation. So does the Sib-Sig ceremony, though. The second line of text destroys creatures when they enter if they were cast, and creates a 2/2 zombie. This does place a serious limitation on what's going to make sense to go with this card, though it's definitely not an insurmountable limitation. When I was searching for a commander for this card, I knew I wanted it to be something on the more generic side to work out with the other restrictions I'd been given, and I also knew I wanted it to do something that combines relatively easy with the Sib-Sig ceremony to produce positive outcomes. In other words, I wanted something low footprint, a commander that kinda just works with the Sib-Sig ceremony without me needing to put in a lot of extra effort or bring in additional cards. This is how I landed on Athreos Shroudveiled. The card is 6 mana, it's indestructible even when I have it fully online via Devotion, and it has an ability that works well alongside ETBs and on-death effects among creatures I play. Even without anything else on my side of the board, the card is just pretty solid if I get it into play on turn 4 off a turn 3 ceremony and start throwing coins on opposing creatures, effectively making Sib-Sig ceremony a worn Power Stone for this precise function. To go along with this, I grabbed a handful of other indestructible and pseudo-indestructible creatures. Erebos Bleakhearted as another god that works well with my zombie tokens, Yahenni as a sack outlet, Breathkeeper Seraph as a unique soulbond creature that can save itself and others, and all 4 in-color Myojins. These are 8 mana spirits that enter with an indestructible counter and can remove this counter to do a variety of powerful effects. So in these instances, we're taking advantage of the Sib-Sig ceremony's powerful ramp potential with creatures that don't care about the rest of its text box, and already amongst these indestructible creatures, we can see a lot of points of cohesion. Erebos plus Myojin of Blooming Dawn can draw a billion cards, and any big Erebos plays are assisted by a free sack outlet like Yahenni. Athreos Shroudveiled and Myojin of Grim Betrayal both work fabulously alongside conventional board wipes, as does Breathkeeper Seraph to a lesser extent, and Myojin of Cleansing Fire is a board wipe. The picture that's being painted so far is of a big mana controlling aristocrats-oriented deck, and to minimize friction, we're going to want to expand on that vision and make sure it's a consistent feature of the deck, starting with mana. The Sib-Sig ceremony provides us a lot of mana through its discount, so the first order of business in making sure the deck works without it is adding a lot of other ramp, finding analogs. Heartless Summoning is the easiest choice here, as a similar 2-mana creature discount plus downside sort of effect. And another solid choice is ramp on ETB creatures like Solemn Simulacrum, Scampering Surveyor, and Core Cartographer. These work on their own as an alternate ladder from 4 to 6 mana to get the commander and give an immediate coin destination, and they also function quite enjoyably with the Sib-Sig ceremony in play, costing 2 less mana and getting their 2/2 bodies replaced with 2/2 zombies. Past these, I choose to add Crowded Crypt as a synergistic rock, a Soul Ring, Mirror Convert for subtype purposes, the wheel decree that this deck needs to have 50 or more subtypes, remember, and 7 other 2-mana rocks to round things out. This deck ended up pretty high curved, so playing a mana rock is really what we want to be doing with our 2-mana turn. So okay, step 1 of this was making sure that this deck can make use of the Sib-Sig ceremony's mana generation, and that it has plenty of other ways to generate mana in the card's absence. Great. But let's think a little harder about this second line of text. It's intended to be a downside, but does it have to be? The biggest area where it isn't a downside is when it comes to creatures that we actively want to die. Take Junji the Midnight Sky. Both the discard and the reanimate modes of this death trigger are solid 3-mana effects, and with the Sib-Sig ceremony, you get that plus a zombie and a death trigger and a thing in your graveyard you can use for other purposes. More on those things later. Same with AO. One mode is a sort of collected company effect, and the other is a big amplification to our board if we're already loaded up with zombies. Both great to get for 3 mana, and even better with some extra goodies tacked on top. We've also got Erebos Bleakhearted and Dark Prophecy as powerful draw engines when creatures die, which pair nicely with both zombie tokens and our non-token creatures meeting an untimely demise. All of this on-death stuff goes great with the Sib-Sig ceremony, though it does also pose a bit of a problem. These cards are a lot less good if we don't have a way for creatures to die. If we assume the Sib-Sig ceremony will always be in play, we're gonna run into some problems when it's not. So, This deck also integrates a number of ways to sacrifice our creatures as well. Analogs for Sib-Sig Ceremony's Destroy effect. Season of Loss is a flexible removal tool that can also draw. Fanatical Devotion is a sack outlet that can also save creatures from destruction. And there are 5 other cards that do some sort of sacrificing task. These are perfect here because they replace the creature death portion of what the Sib-Sig Ceremony does, but most of them are also great when paired with the Sib-Sig Ceremony, and this is the perfect relationship to create with a build-around card. You want the best possible spread of situational usefulness on a card, not just the one that's best when paired with a hidden commander. The same logic applies to this deck's 19 ETB creatures. Each of these will have a bit of a spread when it comes to how effective they are, but the floor is decently high, making their footprint relatively low. As a baseline, they're fine. A deck that's casting a standalone Simulacrum, a standalone Chupacabra, a standalone Croamination. At worst, you're talking about bracket 2 mid-range deck territory. Bring in the Sib-Sig Ceremony, and suddenly the power of these jumps a couple notches up from that, particularly for the 3 to 4 mana ETB creatures. Those creatures are around 2/2 already, so the Sib-Sig Ceremony basically just looks like a 2 mana discount that shoves their real body into the graveyard. Speaking of which, this is where the Aristocrats stuff we mentioned earlier comes into play again. This deck has 5 cards that recur creatures, and it also has the 7 sources of creature sacrifice I mentioned earlier for when the Sib-Sig Ceremony isn't in play to assist creatures with their journey to the graveyard. And when you're using one of those and have a bit more flexibility on your timing for creatures dying, Athreos also works as a recursion engine, offering a ton of value generation alongside of one of the deck's 4 sources of continual sacrifice. If you're getting a Sepulchral Primordial trigger every turn, a Crobomination trigger every turn, or a couple Ashen Rider triggers every turn, you're going to be feeling pretty fabulous about things. There are also a few flicker cards baked into the deck to enhance the ETB plan further, as well as an extra spicy inclusion, Mirror of Life Trapping. This is an artifact that exiles creatures when they enter if they were cast, and then returns them when the next creature enters after being cast. In one sense, this is like a convoluted table-wide ETB doubler, which works with our ETBs, but it also pairs beautifully with the Sib-Sig Ceremony. Instead of getting destroyed, we can order our triggers so that the creatures get sucked into the mirror instead, and then they can join their zombie friend whenever the next creature comes into play. It's actually crazy to me that this isn't run in more Sib-Sig Ceremony decks. Panharmonicon itself is run in 8% of decks with the card, and yet the number of people running Mirror of Life Trapping doesn't even cross the 2% threshold to make the EDH rec page? Wild. This inclusion also brings us back to the idea of footprint, how good it feels to be devoting deck space to a given card. Mirror is a great accompaniment to the Sib-Sig Ceremony, but in a deck with 19 ETB creatures, it'll also just feel solid in general most of the time. This fact is important because this deck is designed in a way that the task of mitigating the Sib-Sig Ceremony's downside is nice, but not essential. Obviously, we won't always have the card in play, and even if we do, there are a single-digit number of creatures that will be really bummed if we play into it, mainly engines like Braids and Sun Titan. These do exist, but because the number of them is small, it wouldn't be worth the deck slot to run a card like Shielded by Faith that would only exist for the purposes of mitigating Ceremony's downside. It also wouldn't be worth it to try and make that mitigating card feel more useful by running additional creatures that we don't want the Sib-Sig Ceremony to bonk, because then we'd be sad when we drew the Sib-Sig Ceremony but not the mitigator. However, what we're doing with Mirror of Life Trapping here threads the needle perfectly. The deck is built to mostly feel good with the Sib-Sig Ceremony, and to also feel decent with Mirror of Life Trapping, and the fact that these pair with each other to give the deck a bunch more flexibility is a bit of extra sauce that pushes Mirror over the edge into being a worthwhile inclusion. Another example of this idea is Fanatical Devotion, the enchantment I mentioned earlier that allows its controller to sacrifice a creature in order to regenerate a creature. This is nice with the Sib-Sig Ceremony, since zombies generated by it can effectively pay to prevent it from destroying future creatures, but it's also just solid as a protection spell, and it's a sack outlet in a deck that can do some very juicy things with a sack outlet. None of these 3 tasks would be good enough on their own to justify giving them deck space, and even doing 2 of the 3 might not be enough, but put all of them together and you've got a card that slots into the deck nicely. So at this point, we've constructed a deck that feels decent without the Sib-Sig Ceremony in play, and hopefully pretty great with it. However, I've omitted arguably one of the most important parts of a hidden commander deck, the tutors. There are 4 of these, and they slot nicely into the deck since 3 of them are ETB creatures, and they all have other useful targets to grab. And that's kinda all there is to say about them. It might be a little odd to you that I saved them for last and spent all of 27 words telling you about them, but in truth, tutors shouldn't be the focus of your attention if you're trying to decide if building around a card in your 99 is feasible. You'll probably want them if you want the card to be part of your plan more often, but focusing first on how the deck works without the card is going to be your easiest road to having a deck that is fun and flexible. I also skimmed over tutors because this is the part of the video where I get to pull the rug out from under this whole operation and tell you that both of the principles I mentioned in this video also apply to ordinary commanders that live in the command zone as well. Principle 1 was to run analogs, cards that do an equivalent task as your hidden commander. The reason for that was that you won't always have access to your hidden commander, either due to removal or due to not finding it, so it's useful to be able to still have some access to whatever that card gives you. That principle isn't quite as important with your actual command zone, since drawing the card isn't part of the equation, but it still might be genuinely useful as a piece of advice. If your commander costs a lot of mana, having cards that do something similar to what it does at a lower cost might help you to have fewer awkward periods in a game when you can't quite afford to cast the card. If your commander is a creature, having a non-creature permanent that does something similar could help if you're playing against a deck that thrives on clearing out boards of creatures. Having a deck that feels truly fluid and cohesive generally means having different options pointed in the same general gameplay direction, and this will often mean cards sharing some of the functions of your commander. Principle 2 was to minimize the footprint of synergizing cards, and this is the much more broadly applicable one in my mind. If you're adding cards to your deck that specifically play well with your commander, it's good if those cards are as flexible and multi-purpose as possible. If I'm playing a Hackball deck, Silvergill Mentor and Jungleborn Pioneer will both pair fabulously with the commander, since they give me 2 bodies for 1 card and can be curved into Hackball. However, these might not actually be the best inclusions, because what if Hackball gets removed and I don't feel like shelling out command tax just yet? What if I draw a different card I'd much rather play on turn 4? What if I draw into some synergy pieces that push advantage in a slightly different direction than my commander on my current board state? What if I'm expecting a board wipe soon? If I add cards to my deck specifically to synergize with my commander and that's all they do, I'm kind of forced into playing and replaying my commander again and again in order to make those cards useful, even when it might be better to develop other parts of my game plan. This is where the minimized footprint comes into play. Cards that do multiple things for your deck, feel useful in multiple situations, these give you more freedom in how you play the game. The easiest way to go with this is having cards that have both a card type you want and also ramp, draw, or remove something. But you can get a lot more intricate with how you make cards feel useful if you try. I do think some people go too far and suggest that your deck should always be able to function just fine without your commander, and this does feel a little silly to say about the commander format. Still, making sure cards feel good across a variety of different situations, or are truly powerful enough to compensate if they're not, is a good way to improve your decks and your experience with the game. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Architect's easy-to-use search bar is great for building decks like this. I can type something like Enter or Sacrifice or Exile, and it'll instantly isolate the cards I want to look at. A link to this deck is down in the description. Also, I'm halfway tempted to actually build and play this deck, since it seems like fun and is pretty cheap. So if you want me to do that, you can type, "This deck looks like a burning trash heap, Alex," down in the comments to goad me into it. Anyways, also supporting the channel is Dragon Shield, creators of quality sleeves, deck boxes, and more. I've recently been using their black outer sleeves for a somewhat strange purpose that I'll probably get into at some point. You might know if you played a game against me recently. And the fit, durability, and shuffle feel of them has been good, as always. Follow the affiliate link down in the description and use code SALUBRIOUS at checkout to get a 10% discount on your order. If you want to support me more directly, you can become a YouTube member or sign up for my Patreon. I made a short bonus video to go with this one about the other restrictions my Civ 6 Ceremony deck had, as well as the nature of strange deck restrictions in general. A preview for that begins right now. On the opposite end of the spectrum, following specific deck building restrictions first and foremost can also make decks more generic, especially if you're trying to make the deck relatively powerful. This is obvious in the case of something like Volo that encourages players to have an especially wide variety of different creatures, but it could even apply to more neutral restrictions like a Garuda or Obosh companion. These are some of the hardest companions to turn into a strong deck due to how severely they restrict the card pool.